Can I ask you a question?
Uh-huh.
It's not really a question. They never are they, really? We need to talk
About
Otago.
or Otago.
Yeah, I think we've done that one.
Yeah.
So, just to be clear, before we start, Otago, let's bust some myths.
Okay.
Let's start with what is it?
Right.
What is it?
What?
Who's it for?
What was it?
What was
you
it?
Mean?
What was it?
Rather than what it's morphed into.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's just pause the morph. What was it? What was it designed to do, set out to do, and to who? And who was going to do it?
Okay.
Who did it?
So the first study was quite small, and it was aimed at those people who were in transition to frailty but still living at home.
In transition to frailty but still living at home.
That wouldn't come into a group class.
Mm-hmm.
Or couldn't. And it was delivered by physiotherapists who did the first assessment of their abilities and where they were due to start on the programme, and that was the four-step test of the chair rise.
Yes.
And then essentially they were supported to do it at home themselves, but they had 6 home visits across 1 year, and in between lots of phone calls, and the phone calls and the visits were there to encourage and motivate, make them appreciate that people actually cared what they were doing. Hence they had pretty good retention rates. To make sure their ankle weights were actually progressed over time, because unless you actually go visit, you can't do that.
So just to be clear, they had ankle weights.
They had ankle weights, and
to be clear,
some individuals went
progressed.
up to 8 kilos a leg. Not many, but some. So they didn't not have any. Some didn't in the first few weeks, as they got the technique right.
Yeah.
So that was the first study. And then the original authors, John Campbell and Claire Robertson, quite rightly thought, this is great, but there's not a huge number of physios around in New Zealand to go buzzing around doing home visits. Yeah. So
do we really need them?
And do we really need them?
Really need them?
They still, quite rightly, because you can't set a level of exercise without doing a pre-exercise assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So the physios still did the first assessment, and then district nurses who were trained by the original Otago team. And by the way, this was 2 weeks of training.
Mm-hmm. 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Not 2 days.
10 days worth of face-to-face training.
Yeah.
Then went off and delivered the progressions, the home visits. Obviously it's on their round because they're district nurses from those areas. So a very cost-effective way of doing it. And with that, they showed a very good, similar reduction in falls.
So just to be clear, the physiotherapist did the initial assessment to identify suitability and baseline start points for exercises. Said to the district nurse, while you're doing this, start them off on this.
Yeah.
And there was this very clear motivational arm. They were called, how's it going? Have you progressed?
And also those physios were available at all points if the nurses needed to speak to them. So if somebody wasn't progressing...
So they were supported?
They were supported. They were the mentors. They were just basically there. So there was that constant liaison with the therapy team.
Was there any indication at that point who Otago was not for? Who wasn't it appropriate for?
Not really, and what they did find is that it was cost neutral for the over 65s. In other words, it didn't reduce falls as much in that group, it didn't improve function as much, and was much more appropriate for the over 80s. Now they just picked that as an age cut-off. They never actually went back and looked at function, for example. And when you speak to Claire, unfortunately John's not with us anymore, it really was more about how far into the transition to frailty they were. And if they were younger and not that frail, i.e. probably walking about without a stick, they weren't going to get the same balance challenge from the Otago exercises. Yeah. They're really very static. Even the dynamic ones are slow. Yeah. They're not reactive. They're not. They are there to reduce base of support, etc. But there's nothing in there in terms of if you tripped, how you would quickly recover, for example. So they're there to build as a building block for someone that's lost most of their balance control, and you're regaining it in early steps. we know from the PROACT study, which was a far more recent one done here,
Yeah.
where we had a group programme versus a home-based programme. Admittedly, it was shorter, but what we found there is that the peer mentors, volunteers that were doing the home visits and the phone calls, people didn't progress their ankle weights. It wasn't challenging enough because these were just sedentary older people, age 65 plus. They were still at home, but there was no transition to frailty in some of them. In fact, we know that from the baseline data. And essentially, it probably just wasn't challenging enough for them. So it was maybe maintaining balance, but it wasn't improving it. And so we're back again to, like anything, for example, someone who's had a stroke, when they first start, they may not be able to lift a tin of baked beans, but 3 weeks later, they can lift a weight. And at that point, you have to change the training.
Yeah.
Because it's no longer going to work.
From beans to maybe sausages.
Sausages, yeah, or weights, or ankle, your proper weights. So Otago was always meant for those in transition to frailty, those that perhaps wouldn't attend a group programme or there wasn't one nearby, and it was always assessed at the starting point. So in other words, if they were relatively good, they got started on the much harder exercises. They didn't all start on a single leg stand.
Everyone's start point was different depending on assessment.
Absolutely.
So just to be clear, just to bust the myths, Otago isn't for all older people. And you could have an 80-year-old triathlete, right? So
it certainly wouldn't work for them.
Yeah.
Not even slightly. Yeah. And to be honest,
they're way past
if they're
beans.
going into a bums and tums class or a Zumba Gold or aerobic, a gentle aerobics class, they won't get any benefit out of Otago because they're probably doing as much strength and balance training in those as we do in Otago.
Yeah. It was progressed. So no ankle weights, no progression, no effect, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, something's better than nothing, but you can.
It's back to the fact it might help maintain, but it won't improve. And if you want to reduce falls, you need to actually improve something, not just maintain it.
Yeah.